KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits on a Friends Friday, and my longtime friend and radio associate, Mark Stevens. Mark, how you doing, man?
Nick Donovan, good to chat with you, buddy. It's been a while.
Mark Brothers Morning Show, man. That has history all over southern Colorado, man.
You know, it's funny, Nick. I started back at the old station, KKFM, back in 1986.
Wow.
No, you know what? I take it back. It was actually 85, and then it was bought by what would become Citadel Broadcasting in 86. We were actually one of the first classic rock stations in the country to sign on.
And you guys kind of marked the trademark classic rock, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Right. When we started, we were calling ourselves Colorado Classics, which in the long run was kind of cool. It was way more eclectic of a format. I remember that nobody really knew how to do classic rock. We were going up against the legendary Kilo, of course, and they had the rock market kind of cornered.
Right.
And I remember one of our consultants or somebody that they had hired and it was skeptical. They were like, well, how many times can you play Sweet Home Alabama? Well, it turns out you can play it a lot, I guess, because it's still going on.
On every radio station, every format, it's still going on. And you know, I just traveled. I just got back yesterday from Tampa, and when you go through Alabama, when you cross into Alabama, the sign that says "Welcome to Sweet Home Alabama," so it's still got some juice, you know.
It's everywhere. And you know what they found out, Nick, was that classic rock hit this sort of nostalgic chord amongst us baby boomer types and even young. I remember, you know, when we were first starting out, we had younger listeners coming up that were hearing some of these songs for the first time, or they'd heard them growing up with their parents, and they were discovering Zeppelin and these classic rock icons for the first time. And it was kind of cool, actually.
And we kind of got the same deal going with classic hits, you know. They're hearing the Doobie Brothers in Chicago and maybe Billy Joel for the first time, you know, kind of the same mentality,
By the way,
really.
I just saw the Doobie Brothers a couple months ago down in Phoenix.
Uh-huh.
They sounded great. They're on their 50th anniversary tour.
Wow.
And it was one of the best concerts I've been to, honestly. I was totally shocked how great they sounded. So, you know, that's why there's so much staying power with these bands, I think, with the music. The ones that can go out and still tour on the road.
Absolutely.
It's amazing to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look at the Rolling Stones. Gosh.
Sure.
Yeah, 60 plus years or whatever. But, hey, you and I will be around in 60, we hope.
Yeah, right. Keeping it rocking, man. Well, I'm glad that you're still doing your thing there, too. That's good to know.
Well, thank you. It's good to have you on the show, and you can hang around a little bit this morning?
You betcha.
All right. Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show in here on a Friends Friday on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits. It's Pueblo's greatest hits, KPHT 95.5 on a Friends Friday. My friend in today, Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show. Where did you start your radio career?
You know, interestingly enough, we were talking about me being back here in Durango before, but that's where I started. I started doing high school football on one of the AM stations down here.
Uh-huh.
And then in 1982, somebody you probably know, DJ McCoy.
Oh, yeah. My brother sold him a car here like a year ago.
Of course you did. Because we're all like, you know, interrelated somehow. But DJ came down with Dan Lacey, and who had KIIQ
right
in Manitou Springs. They put a station on in Durango, and I sort of talked my way on the air and did about 3 years there. And then DJ came back to Colorado Springs, and he brought me with him, and that's where I started there in 1985. And then when we were purchased by Citadel Broadcasting, what would become Citadel Broadcasting, they fired everybody except me. And I'll never forget this. And you know this feeling, Nick, when you see a program director coming down the hall, and they just fired everybody. He walked into the studio, and he goes, you know, I think we're gonna keep you on. We don't think you can hurt us too much. It's like, that's a fine way to start your career.
Yeah, there's a left-handed compliment. Yeah, I always figured they've kept me around because I don't make any money still. It's like, this guy doesn't cost us.
That was another thing, too.
Yeah, so it was KIIQ when you came back to Colorado Springs then?
Well, it was still that, and then it was KKFM. It was at that time. It was what was it? It was 96.5. We talked about the frequency, and I think they called it 96 Rock.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I kind of remember that. So
yeah, remember those days?
Yeah,
it was kind of a top 40 station,
right?
And then we switched to classic rock. I did about I think a year and a half. Various time slots, did middays, did an all-night shift when they still had those.
Right.
And then in 1988, the legendary Scott Thrower had been doing mornings there. He left for a bigger market, and so they put myself and Mark Goldberg in, who had been working with Scott doing news, and they put us in. That was only supposed to be a temporary thing, so we had a little fun with that because we're supposed to be just a temporary. Somebody suggested Mark Brothers, and that kind of stuck. And because there was no pressure on us, it was pretty freewheeling. It was
what a great feeling.
Just kind of crazy. Yeah.
Oh wow. So that was the birth of the Mark Brothers then, basically.
That was it, 1988. And that incarnation lasted to about 1992. And then we had another guy in there for a couple years. And then in 1994, it was Steve Medley who came in with me. He was a stand-up comic at the time.
Right.
And so we kept the same name, Mark Brothers Morning Show, because by that point it was a brand.
Right.
But the show began to evolve at that point. It was pretty amazing.
Well, Mark Goldberg's girlfriend did morning news with me at one time. Long time ago.
Again, we're all it's like the 6 degrees of separation, right? We can trace ourselves back to all these things.
And Kevin Bacon or whatever, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Oh man, well, good stuff there. And as you were mentioning, the frequency change, that's what affected, because KCCY, which is 96.9 right now, our sister station here, was at what, 96.5?
I think it was.
Or 98.5 or something. I don't remember.
98. There was that frequency change. We went for the longtime listeners out there, they remember that we were at 96.5 for a long time. And then we had to move to 98.1. So, and that was to accommodate another station in Denver and also KCCY. And so it was just one of those FCC things. But to do that, we did one of the classic radio promos that I had done where I was on the air for 98 straight hours.
Oh, I've done that too. That is
yes. Haven't we all done something like that? Yeah. And it was crazy because this was back before voice tracking, which would enable you to do that pretty easy these days. I was actually there. And the station was at the Satellite Hotel. If you remember, we had our station up there on top in the penthouse up there. And so I had a room down there. I would try to sneak in an hour or two of sleep, sleep a night and then come back on. But by the end of that, it was almost 4 days straight. I was hallucinating.
That's what people don't understand. I did the same thing. Right? And you do. You're like, I did it one time from a grocery store where I stayed on the air for like 70 some hours from a grocery store. And I couldn't, by the time we were done, I couldn't realize, I didn't even know where I was. I couldn't picture where I was. Yeah. It's crazy.
We actually closed the broadcast, Nick, at the Dublin House. It was the final broadcast at 96.5. So I don't know if you remember a guy named Bob Jackson. He was a photographer for the Gazette at the time. He is the one that took that famous picture of Lee Harvey Oswald getting shot by Jack Ruby. And he was there. He was taking pictures of me and the staff. And I remember coming up to him. I go, say, hey, Bob, how does this compare to the Lee Harvey Oswald shot? It's kind of in the same thing, isn't it? That's how a little out of it I was at that point after 98
Mark Stevens in here from the Mark Brothers Morning Show on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits on a Friends Friday. It's Pueblo's greatest hits, KPHT 95.5 on a Friends Friday. My friend in today, Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show. A lot of radio history going down here this morning. I don't know if it's all good or bad, but I had Mike Daniels on here a few weeks ago. We go back a few years on some stuff there too, but
Mike, I always liked Mike, and he's like those guys. He's one of those guys that never ages.
Exactly.
You see him on TV, he looks exactly like he did 30 years ago.
Yeah, I agree.
How are you doing that?
It's because he got out of radio, because I have certainly aged. I know that.
Right. That's what people do. I mean, it was really, really fun, but it was kind of a hard life, especially getting up doing a morning show.
Yeah.
Which I think took about 10 years off my life. But those were the days. And Nick, and I've heard some of your other conversations here, that radio was a different animal back then.
Absolutely.
We didn't have social media. We didn't have the internet till later. And it just was people relied on it a lot more for news and for information,
right,
and for stuff. And you had just really, really devoted listeners. That's one thing that I really always appreciated about the Mark Brothers show, was we had some of the craziest, most devoted listeners you could possibly imagine for a radio show, and it was really a spectacular time in radio.
Absolutely. I remember one time that was the blizzard of '97, I believe, and nobody could get into the station. Well, I got in because I had a vehicle I could get in, and there was only one station on in southern Colorado. In Pueblo, it was KCCY, which was at 96.9, and I think there was one station in the Springs, and I think Chuck Baker was on. But I got in here, and I was on for like 30 hours nonstop because nobody else could get in, and the police department was using me to reach out to people because they needed four-wheel drives, and then the sheriff's department was calling me what gas stations are open, and it was, like right. You said, it was radio was a lifeline back then.
Well, we were actually on the air. I had agreed to do a Saturday morning shift. We had a new program director at the time, and he begged me to do a shift because he didn't have people he'd hired yet that he wanted to do weekends. So I said, okay, I'll help you out this one time. Well, that's when that snowstorm began. And I remember driving in, I'm like, this is kind of not good. And I was actually, again, one of those crazy radio stories, was holed up in that studio, KKFM, for, I think, 18 straight hours. We were on the air. But, of course, being what that station was, as opposed to you doing actually public service things, we had people delivering Jack Daniels on snowmobiles. We had, restaurant. We had these people just wandering in. We had a big party going on the entire day in the station studio. We broke into the vending machine.
I was going to say, you're having a party, and I'm eating M&Ms trying to stay alive,
right. I know. That was one of the greatest things ever. I mean, and you remember how shut down everything was. So we're taking calls, from liquor stores, if they were open or not. That was our public service.
That's hilarious. I did not know that. But yeah, we were the lifelines for all kinds of stuff because there was no social media. And if your phone wasn't working, or I remember people were using battery operated radios because they didn't have electricity. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, power was out, and so it was really a touchstone at the time. That's another one of those crazy stories. It only happens in that era of radio, too,
right?
I think.
Yeah. Now, you wouldn't know. It's a totally different situation.
You'd just be looking at your phone. Yeah.
Do you stay in touch with any of the other Mark brothers that you had throughout history there?
Yeah, I do. Unfortunately, the last time I saw Steve Medley, his wife had passed away, and that was a year ago in October, actually. We had a nice kind of a get-together there in Colorado Springs with some of the old people, and some listeners came out. We were at a sports bar where she had liked to frequent, and he gave a very nice, moving, touching tribute to his wife, and we had, and Beth, who I remember, some of our longtime listeners will remember that we had Beth Clements on for a while. It was the Mark Brothers and Beth. She was that strong of a personality. That was probably, I think, about 96 to 97, about a year and a half that Beth was on with us, and she was there. And so that, the thing about the Mark Brothers, too, Nick, is that we sort of added people along the way, lost some people along the way. and always kept the show kind of in one particular direction.
Right.
And I can elaborate because we went on to Dallas and then Washington. I can tell you a little bit about that, too, is how that all turned out here in a bit.
Yeah, if you can hang on, and we'll do that coming up next, if that's okay.
Sure, you bet.
All right. Mark Stevens in here on a Friends Friday on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits on a Friends Friday, Mark Brothers Morning Show. It's Pueblo's greatest hits, KPHT 95.5 on a Friends Friday. My friend in today, Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show. Old radio stories abound here today. Yeah.
And it is, like we mentioned before, like we had kind of chatted about before, it was a different era in radio. And
absolutely.
It seems that, and sadly, there's still people like you that are still chugging along out there. But I think I heard you're talking to my friend Karen a few weeks ago.
Right.
I think was there one or two people in your studio or in your station now, as opposed to, and the same thing began to happen where I was too. We lost a bunch of people that consolidated. Unfortunately, some of the corporations that own stations nowadays, they're not as people friendly as in the old days.
Well, and that was half the fun of radio, was the camaraderie around the radio station, all the craziness, because you had all these different personalities, including the sales staff that had very unique personalities, and it just made everything, it was constant fun, and I remember
the kind of people that, like you said, the kind of people that were attracted to a job in radio, whether you be on air, you be in promotions, or you be in sales, it sort of attracted a different kind of personality.
Right.
to work in that business. And that was fun. We had a lot of just kind of odd and fun and eclectic salespeople that came through there over the years. And it just was a lot of fun back in those days.
Absolutely. Well, you said you went on to Dallas. So you went from Colorado Springs to Dallas, correct?
Correct. So we had a really good program director, Max, who came in and took over the show, programming the station, and then kind of really got the show focused back on what was working for us at the time. He got an offer to program a classic rock station in Dallas, very legendary KZPS down there in Dallas. And so we went down oddly enough, following Bob and Tom, who didn't really work out in Texas, didn't work out in Dallas very well. So we came on, and it was a struggle. If people know that if you're not from Texas, it takes them a while to accept.
I'll bet, yeah.
That you're there, yeah. And so, it kind of, it did okay. We did all right. We definitely improved the ratings that we came in to replace the show, Bob and Tom show. But then they were able to sort of reunite their old morning show back in Dallas, and they let us go. And so from there, after about a few months, we went to Washington, D.C. for a classic rock station. Now, we actually worked in the same station that the Grease Man.
I was just going to say the legendary Grease Man from D.C., yeah.
I remember a few times I was sitting, and it was a really odd little studio. It was in the basement of like a townhome that they had converted into a sort of a radio station in Rockville, Maryland. And I remember sitting there one day going, I am standing here where the Grease Man stood. And it was like one of those moments that just sort of hit you like, wow, that's pretty cool.
That's like walking into Sun Studios or something,
Right, yeah. Exactly. For those people that know radio, the Grease Man was legendary, especially there in D.C. He had and that was a whole different market. Markets are different where you go.
Sure.
From Colorado Springs to Dallas, obviously different culture, different kind of references. But from Dallas to Washington, D.C., that was they called D.C. when you're there, and you figure this out pretty quick, the Hollywood of the East. But it's more like politicians and lobbyists and those kind of big personalities that are there as opposed to actors. And it's a whole different kind of audience that was tuned in. And we actually did okay there as well. We had to change the show a lot to what we did. Some of the things that we did in Colorado Springs, obviously, was pretty native to that particular town, to Colorado Springs. And Southern Colorado, Pueblo too. Back in the day, we had a huge following in Pueblo.
I know. It used to piss me off all the time.
Yeah, I know. I remember you telling me that once when we ran into each other. It's like, why do you have to come down here?
You're on my turf, man.
That's right. But yeah, those were fun. And that was when we could actually do that. We could compete against each other and have fun about it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Now there's no competition because we all own the competition. It's kind of that way now. Yeah. But...
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show in here on a Friends Friday on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits. It's Pueblo's greatest hits, KPHT 95.5 on a Friends Friday. My friend in today, Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show. Colorado Springs. We've talked about Colorado Springs, Dallas, Washington, D.C. You're in Durango now, kind of full circle from where you started, basically.
I did. I came back to Colorado Springs and came back to the station in 2009 and did the afternoon show. And that was interesting because, when I had been in an ensemble for so long,
right,
that being a solo act took me a little while.
It's hard to adjust to that, yeah.
It is, and people were calling up, so that was fun. When I first came back in 2009, there were a lot of old Mark Brothers listeners calling in and reminding me of some of the crazy stuff that we used to do. We had Andy the intern. We actually, I don't know if you remember, Nick, we ran him for mayor. In Colorado Springs, he got 1,100 votes. 1,100 votes, and that was the most ridiculous thing. I guess I should have seen all the weird stuff in politics we have now coming. When we could get an intern get 1,100 votes for mayor, and what was funny was all the TV stations and even some of the news radio stations, they were forced to cover him because he was on the ballot,
right?
And he was a candidate. So we'd watch him on TV and we'd go, "Can you believe we're doing this?" This is nuts. But yeah, so that was a fun run doing the afternoons because I also did some promotions and were able to do some cool concerts and the Colorado State Fair, which I always loved doing that stuff. Territory days, all those things that we did. But when I came back down here into Durango in the southwest corner of the state, I met with a couple of the radio stations here, and I realized, whoo, boy, this is really small town. But that's kind of cool because they, here I was, a guy with almost 40 years radio experience in bigger markets and morning show experience, but they were going to just stick with the people they had. And I'm like, I kind of admire that.
Right. Right.
Your loyalty to people that you've been working here. And even though I hear so many things being done not the way I would do it, but it's that small town radio thing that is still at least there's functioning radio stations still down here, which is a good thing.
I'm going to say it's probably a big portion of the city still. A big part of what goes on there.
Sure, they still do pretty well down here, and they have their own way of doing things, and for the most part, it's pretty traditional. Although you're probably like me, when you hear another radio station, you hear somebody babbling on and on and on. I'm like, punch out, dude!
Yeah.
Get out of that break! Get out of that break!
You got to steer over there. Now's the time. Yeah.
That's right. There's an exit coming up. Just take it.
Which is what we're going to do right now. Mark Stevens in here on a Friends Friday on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits. It's Pueblo's greatest hits, KPHT 95.5 on a Friends Friday. My friend in today, Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show in Colorado Springs and Pueblo for many years here. And one of the things immediately when I think of the Mark Brothers, obviously I think of you, but Mr. Manley, how did that all come about, Mr. Manley?
So that's really interesting how that whole thing happened. So in radio, for those that don't know, there's various comedy services you could subscribe to, right? And we used to get these compact, the CDs. We used to call them compact laser discs back in the day, right? But we'd get these bits on the CD. And I saw one day one came in the mail, and I'm like, what is this Mr. Manley thing here? So I clicked on there, and I'm like, oh, this just might work here. The problem was, they just did it really, really dry. It was one character. And so what I decided to do and what we did with the show was we made it way more interactive. I put sound effects in there.
Right.
I had, when he would go to the Manly Manual, I'd have pages flipping. And
so you worked it.
Thing. Yeah, but you know what? That turned out to be the way to do it because we were very successful with that character. And there was a few other markets around the country. I think he had, maybe 50 markets around the country that were doing that character, maybe more, but only a handful of them did well with it because that's how, you had to sort of make it sound like he was right there next to you.
Right.
And as it turned out, we were so successful with it that we brought him in. He was actually a guy down in Texas that was doing it. And we became very good friends with him, brought him up, and we did live events at Hooters and various sports bars.
And Mr. Manly was actually there.
He was actually there, and it became a huge deal. He would, he published 2 Manly manuals. He had a best of CD, and then people would bring him in to autograph. And the funny thing was, we would just do these crazy things when he was in town because everybody wanted to show, oh, be manly and good day. And
Right.
We had a kid one time. This was at Frankie's over on the east side of Colorado Springs. Who ate a bucket of lard. I'm not sure why. But he ended up puking it back up, and that was all part of the whole thing. He's like, that's what you do, buddy.
So what did this Mr. Manly look like? Was he a big guy, small guy? What did he look like?
He was just sort of the funny thing was when you saw him in person, he was a funny guy. He was an actor, right? He had been an actor down in Austin, Texas, where he lived, and he came up with this character. But he almost had to be coaxed into playing the character when he was out live. I remember, in fact, I was talking with somebody about this the other day, how the first time we brought him into Hooters, he sat down, he ordered a salad and a white wine. I'm going, no, dude, that's
not
Mr. Manly. Mr. Manly does not eat salad and drink white wine.
You order a triple cheeseburger.
Right, exactly. He was an average kind of guy, but he was really, because of his acting experience, he was really good in crowds. He knew how to work the crowd. So we had a lot of fun with that guy, I tell you.
I'll tell you, and here, how many years later, we still are talking about Mr. Manly. People still remember him. I remember a guy telling me the TV show Home Improvement came out, and I said, I was working somewhere, and I asked the guy, I says, "What's this show about?" And he goes, "Well, this guy," and we didn't really know who Tim Allen was. He's like Mr. Manly, man. He's always messing everything up, and he's like, right away, I knew what it was like, and I loved that show ever since, But that's how he described it. It's like, this guy's Mr. Manly on TV.
It was. And in fact, Mr. Manly, I think it was Fox TV network, actually sort of had a development deal with him at one point, trying to get that character onto TV. But they for some reason, they could never quite translate it over. I think, because it was a 2 or 3 minute bit, right, on every day. We'd play it, a couple times a day. I remember having guys at Fort Carson come up and tell me that they would delay PT until Mr. Manly aired.
Was over.
Right. Then they'd get on with PT and other basic stuff. That's how important it was.
That's how important, you bet.
Right.
Mark Stevens in here on a Friends Friday from the Mark Brothers Morning Show on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits. It's Pueblo's greatest hits, KPHT 95.5 on a Friends Friday. My friend in today, Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show, many years on in southern Colorado here, actually on at a competitive radio station, but you guys were so powerful, I thought, this would be awesome to have you back on the radio here in southern Colorado. So thank you for taking the time to be here. We were talking about Mr. Manly a few minutes ago, and Mr. Manly, man, that kind of defined the radio station, seems like.
You're absolutely right, because what it did with the kind of character that was, that allowed us, and especially when I brought, Steve Medley into the show, who had been a stand-up comic for 10 years and had a different kind of approach to more of a long form kind of humor as opposed to short, punchy radio bits.
Right.
So he wrote a bunch of skits that probably we couldn't have gotten away with had we not had the latitude, that Mr. Manley gave us. Well, I remember one time we went out and we had Pink Floyd tickets when Floyd was touring at some point in the 90s.
Uh-huh.
And we did that classic radio bit. What would you do for Pink Floyd tickets? Well,
yeah,
people turned out they would do a lot of weird stuff. And we had people covered with duct tape, hooking up electrodes to themselves, wrestling in mud. And I often think about, because I sometimes will flip through some of these pictures that I have, I'm like, we could never do that today because there'd be, one, way too much liability.
Right.
No station would ever allow you to put people in harm's way.
Right. Believe me, I know.
Yeah. And there was a bit that we did. I remember it was called Trash Can Car Bowling, where we would actually go to a Home Depot, get trash cans, and people would drive their cars into them like bowling pins.
So you'd put them up in the way like bowling pins are. You'd stack them that way. Yeah. Okay.
Stack them in that sort of triangular shape thing, and that was and they would cry. And then we had a guy one time brought his kid down with a go-kart, and the go-kart crashed in there with like a 10-year-old kid driving. And I'm like, I don't know how safe this is. Of
course, that's after the fact, yeah.
Yeah, we did. That's the thing you did back then, Nick. You asked, you didn't ask for permission. You asked for forgiveness afterwards, right?
Yeah. It kind of goes back to the, the WKRP, the turkey drop, that kind of stuff,
Exactly. And whoever did WKRP had obviously worked in a radio station because
no doubt
they knew the ins and outs of all that stuff working.
No doubt. Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show in here on a Friends Friday on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits. It's Pueblo's greatest hits, KPHT 95.5 on a Friends Friday. My friend Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show. Man, we've worked in radio together and apart and different things. Never in the same radio station or never for the same company, but we would show up at the same location many times over the years, including the state fair and things like you mentioned. But, one of the things I remember, and again, we didn't work together at this time, but the Friday morning sing-along that you used to do, to me, was awesome. That was just awesome stuff, man. And
that was... I tell you, that was like a 20-minute aerobic exercise because let me take listeners into the studio. This was before that we were all digital, right? We didn't have computers in the studio where I could load up sound effects. So what I did, and you remember the days of carts, the old 8-tracks.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They're like 8-tracks for people that don't know what a cart was. I had a row of 6 cart machines, and it was just in and out, running around that studio, finding carts that I wanted for a particular song or whatever. It was about 20, 25 minutes of crazy music. I'd try to find stuff in the news.
I was going to say you'd have sound bites from the news in there and things, yeah.
It was, I had stuff from Phil Donahue when he would have his odd guests on and the way he would describe them. We'd pop that in there. And it was literally, I would break into a sweat and be completely exhausted by the time the damn thing was over. But people, they never forgot that. That was like a part of the Friday, just what they did.
It was like 7:10 to like 7:30 or something, right? Wasn't it something like that?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. And we, that was kind of the kickoff to the weekend, whatever we might be doing for the weekend, special programming or whatever.
Right.
And sometimes we'd have people in there as guests, and they would they'd have to stay out of the way because I was moving around and there was so fast, throwing stuff around. And but that was fun. Again, things that you probably could not do today as much. Nobody would want to give away a 20 or 30-minute block of airtime to that kind of thing.
Yeah, to not making any money at it, just a fun thing, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, great radio. Mark Brothers Morning Show. We've got Mark Stevens in here on a Friends Friday on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits. It's Pueblo's greatest hits, KPHT 95.5 on a Friends Friday. One more time, my friend Mark Stevens in here from the Mark Brothers Morning Show. Man, I appreciate you taking the time. I know you got all kinds of things going on, a lot of personal life stuff going on and all that, but it's fun to have you back on the radio here in Southern Colorado.
Well, I appreciate it, Nick. It's great talking with you after all these years. You know, I'm working part-time. I'm sort of semi-retired, and I'm working part-time in a liquor store, which seems to make sense coming out of all those years in radio. But it's really been actually a fun little job for me because, as you know, in radio, you're always constantly trying to come up with new ideas, new promotions. There was a lot of pressure, especially in the days when they started kind of slashing the budget a little bit. You were forced to really stretch out and try to find things that work. Whereas in this job, I just come in and, stock up Pabst Blue Ribbon 30 packs and I'm good, man.
So if somebody... go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just said it's amazing how much people drink. I thought we drank a lot back in the radio days, but whoo, man.
So if somebody wants to see Mark Stevens and you're in Durango, what liquor store do we need to go to?
It's called Upper East Side Liquors. It's right there at the crossroads as you come into town from the east side. And it's about 10 miles outside of town, and it looks like a big barn. You can't miss it. And it's actually been a really fun job. I never thought that I would. It's been almost 4.5 years, and we survived the pandemic. Like everybody else did,
sure.
Although in our case, business actually went up.
Right.
Considerably.
Liquor stores and marijuana shops went crazy during the pandemic,
Exactly. Yeah, it went crazy.
Can you think of the fun you guys, the Mark Brothers, would have had with the legalization of marijuana around,
I know. It was just sort of happening when I was still doing afternoons, but I'm like, this is way more morning show material.
Right.
And I remember when it first was happening, the radio stations were really afraid of it at first because we can't really advertise this legally, and it's just it's grown obviously since then. But back in the days, that was some fun stuff.
Absolutely. If you had to do it all over again, I'll bet you'd do it all over again, wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was a time of life that you can. I tell people that all the different comedians and the different actors and musicians that we got to interview or we had in studio, especially when I was in the bigger markets.
Right.
In Dallas and Washington, we had a lot of very cool guests that were at the Improv in both cities, or they were coming through on some kind of promotional gig, and they would come into the studio with us, and that was just way too much. I know we had the same thing in Colorado Springs, more so with comedians that would come through and do their stops there. But those kind of people you don't. And the one thing also I got to do, Nick, was go up in that F-16 when the Thunderbirds came through in the 90s.
Wow.
I would just as I was sitting here reminiscing, I forgot to tell you about that. But in '92. They were doing media tours, and I got a chance to go up in that F-16 with the Thunderbird pilot and in the two-seater, the trainer plane, and that was something you could never do. No, private citizen doesn't get that chance very often, and the media allowed you to do things that you would normally not be able to do in radio, especially in that era.
Sure.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. I would do it again in a heartbeat.
Who was the best interview you had?
That's a good question. Well, I tell you what, we had really good comedians in all the time. A lot of fun stuff there. One of the weirder interviews I ever did was Stephen Stills. I was a big fan of Stephen Stills, right? So he came in D.C., and he was on tour, and he came in. I came in on a Saturday to do a special interview with him on the station, and he just couldn't have been a worse person. I brought all my Stephen Stills CDs for him to sign, and he looked at him and he goes, "Why don't you play the new record?" And, and I remember his tour manager came up and said, "Yeah, he's really tired. He's been in a bus for a long time." And I'm like, oh, man, what a disappointment.
I kind of had the same thing happen with Wayne Brady, but he didn't come in the studio. He called me. I was looking forward to interviewing Wayne Brady because he's a funny guy, and he was not funny at all. He was a jerk, and I had to attribute to that he probably just got done doing some gig somewhere, and now he's got to talk to this radio guy in Pueblo, Colorado or something. I don't know, but he was not fun at all.
When we were down in Dallas, we had a guy that could do a dead-on impersonation of Charlie Sheen, dead-on. And so we had Bret Michaels from Poison on once, and they were good friends. And so we had the guy that did Charlie Sheen asking him, say, hey, we got Charlie Sheen on the other line here, Brett. And it really fooled him for about 10 minutes.
Oh, you're kidding.
until he figured it out. He asked some question that only Charlie would have known the answer to, and then we had to confess. But hey, that worked out pretty good. We'll save that audio.
Well, fun stuff, man. Oh, fun stuff. If you ever get back up this way in southern Colorado, definitely look me up. We need to go have a Mr. Manley salad or something like that, Yeah.
What I need to do is go over to the Coors Tavern and have a slopper.
Now we're talking. Now, anytime you head this way, you let me know. We will do that. But
I'll be through. I'll definitely do that, man. Thanks, Nick. I really appreciated talking with you today. It was great.
Absolutely. Mark Stevens from the Mark Brothers Morning Show on a Friends Friday on KPHT 95.5, Pueblo's greatest hits.